Welcome to Logistics Uncoded, the podcast delivering a real talk on career advancement for air and Space Force civilian logisticians. What are the unwritten rules for getting ahead? We're decoding the pathways to success, one conversation at a time. Your career uncoded starts now.
Welcome to today's Logistics Career Field episode. Today we are honored to speak with Miss Estep as she prepares to retire after more than 4 decades of civilian service. Miss Estep has served not only the Navy, the Air Force, but she's done Joint Force as well. So it's an honor to get to speak with her today. She's worked across logistics at every level, supporting everything from parts availability to aircraft readiness, to workforce, to policy, and enterprise level decisions in Washington. Today's conversation is about leadership, lessons learned, and how logistics truly enables the mission. Ms. Estep, thank you for being here today. And we're excited to record this with you, and thank you for joining us.
All right. Thank you, Kim.
So you began your career as a logistics management intern with the Navy, and you've arrived at the most senior of civilian leaders in the Air Force. For those that are just starting out, what lessons stayed with you throughout your career?
Yeah, so when I started as an intern, I had a mentor that really spent some time providing me kind of foundational enterprise experience. And what I mean by that is every Friday he used to write down questions for me that were topics of the day or concerns or issues that were of the day, and would send me out to talk to people about getting the answers to his questions. And some of them might be program questions, some of them might be resource questions, could be operational questions on things that were going on. And every week I would come back in and attempt to answer his questions. And he always had follow-up ones that required me to go talk to someone else. So for instance, if there was a program out there, I would go talk to the program manager. And of course, the program manager would give me glowing remarks on how great the program was and how great it was going to be for the user community. And then my mentor would send me out to the user community who, at the beginning of the installation of this program, hated it because they wanted to go back to their regular processes and the technology that they had already had. And then he would send me to the resource person who also hated the program because it was over cost and over budget. And they now had to figure out how they were going to get additional resources to complete the program. And so I was early on in my career, I began to understand multiple perspectives. And if you really wanted to get the full picture, you needed to talk to the multi-disciplined activities that surround any issue, whether that's operational or acquisition programs. There's always other sides to the story about what's going on. And so I was able to learn that pretty early on in my career. So not just getting the depth within logistics that I was getting from experiences, but also having a mentor that had me probe out and look at that sort of the enterprise view of what was going on and not just a particular view. That really followed me throughout my career of really being able to prepare and understand not just what was in my foxhole, but the perspectives of other people and how you needed to understand that in order to really make progress and move forward.
That's a great answer. So that it kind of reminds me really of how the construct of the IPTs that we have out in the acquisition programs are to begin with, right? So you have your FM folks, your contracting folks, your engineering folks, and the logistics, and really it's incumbent upon, the PM to really weigh all of the functional impacts, for the overarching best decision. And so, if the contracting folks are reiterating the FM perspective instead of giving the contracting perspective, or if The loggies are reiterating the PM perspective instead of giving the sustainment perspective. You don't really get a full picture. So I appreciate that, and I understand why that makes sense, and why that would have taught you to, kind of look at all of the different perspectives from not just from your foxhole. So how soon did it take before you realized just how impactful logistics is on the mission?
Well, it happened pretty early on because I was in transportation, physical distribution, and we were supporting ships at sea. And so you started truly understanding the dependencies that operations had on the logistics, no matter where you were. You know, when you're developing a logistics strategy for operations at sea, it's really critical to take as much as you can with you on board, because it's really difficult to do underway replenishment at sea. Um, you're in all kinds of sea states, you're in all kinds of weather. And one of my first activities was to document, if you will, a history of support at sea. And I went and got pictures from all of the underway replenishments that we had to support and plan for. And if we were in the Arctic, there was ice hanging off the sides, and people were trying to take on cargo from another ship through pulleys and ramps and activities in that sort of weather. And so um, the underway replenishment activities were pretty dangerous. And so you wanted to make sure that as much as possible, you met the ship at each port, getting the spares and supply and resupplies that they need at each of those ports, because that was the safest way to provide the logistics. But that wasn't always possible. And sometimes with my caps and things that you needed, you would have to provide some underway replenishment, sometimes by helicopter, sometimes by COD, carry on board delivery, small aircraft that we used to deliver the parts. And so it was pretty important to get time definite delivery to support the operations. Then when I moved over to the Air Force, I didn't have that basis of operational experience because I'd grown up and gotten the foundational experience within the Navy. And I moved over. My first job within the Air Force was in program management in the acquisition arena in technology and systems. And I didn't have a perspective for the operations of the Air Force and how the Air Force presented forces. And that impacted some decisions that I made because I didn't know the specifics. I knew I had experience with the Navy, but not with the Air Force. And my experience with the Navy was on the ship side of it predominantly. It was not on the aviation side. And so what changed that is when they tapped me to go to the Pentagon after 9/11, and we had to support OEF and OIF, and we were sending our troops to embed with the Army in convoys and convoy operations. And the first set of individuals that we deployed overseas, I received a couple of emails about how concerned they were that they weren't really trained for the mission. And then I received a couple of more, and then it was a couple of more. And I called the chief then and said, we've got something going on here. There's a problem. We sat down and had talked to the Army about what experiences and what the expectations would be of our airmen embedded in the Army convoy operations. And we thought we had trained them appropriately to take on those roles. But what we found out is we had been talking past each other. And this is why communication becomes key, I think, in any sort of complex leadership problem. When the Army talked about personal protection, the Air Force thought about their personal protection, which was their personal issued weapon where they would then protect themselves from whatever was going on. When the Army talked about personal protection, they were talking about anyone from that convoy had to be able to man the gun mount that was taking care of the convoy to personally protect all the people in the unit. And we hadn't trained our folks to do that. And the Army was expecting that. There was a certain process and procedure that the Army practiced and practiced and practiced to get what they called muscle movement of how they would stance when they were potentially attacked or surrounded in the convoy. And we hadn't trained our folks to do that. And so the Army and the Air Force were now very concerned that we had deployed people without the proper training. So our chiefs took immediate action and we put training in place. And our airmen were the next set that we deployed were trained and ready to go, to the fact that, in fact, the Air Force embedded unit into the Army won the Army Convoy Unit of the Year. So our Air Force people could do it if we gave them the right training. And so it was really important to learn that communication and making sure that when you're talking what seems to be similar concepts, that you're really understanding that you may be talking past each other. And this happens all the time in the joint arena. It also happens in those multifunctional teams that you were talking about, where there may be discussions going on financially or contractually, which everybody thinks they understand, but our tribes tend to talk in jargon. So contracting people understand what contracting people are saying, and logistics people understand what logistics people are saying, but it's not necessarily true that the program managers and or the rest of the multidiscipline team understands the impact or the jargon, if you will, of what's being discussed. And so we don't train our program managers in logistics. We don't necessarily train our logisticians in contracting. And you think you may be understanding what people are saying, but a further exploration and dialogue of the impacts, and even let me make sure that I understand what you said so that I can understand kind of the complexities that you're talking about that I don't have experience in.
Yes, ma'am, that makes sense. So I think there was an article, and you may have been the one to send it, that talked about communication is great, but without comprehension, it's just a lot of talking, right? So I do appreciate that. And really over the last the last couple of years, I think that we've seen that quite a bit, because just trying our best to get integration with sustainment and acquisition and the operational folks. I mean, there's we don't all use the same language, and sometimes those of us that have kind of sat on all different sides, when we realize that we're not talking about the same thing, we have to have the courage to speak up and say, oh, whoa, I think that you understand this a little bit differently than what they're trying to communicate, and kind of helping revector that conversation. So I appreciate that. So there was a follow-on discussion. I think that you may have covered it, but I'll give you another opportunity too. It says many airmen and civilians don't always see how decisions are made at higher levels and how that affects their daily work. Looking back, which early assignments do you think that really helped you connect those dots?
Yeah, so I think lots of early experiences. One that I can recall, many of us get an opportunity to serve on inspection teams, and we go out on IGs. Kim, I know you have some experience on that. I also have some. So I went out, and my area to inspect was going to be in packaging and material handling. That's kind of what I was doing. And I started doing the inspections. And of course, you have a checklist, and you go through the checklist. Well, the checklist is predominantly made by a functional person that knows that area and knows what to look for, right?
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily looking at what is going on before that step or what goes on after that step, because they're laser focused on making sure that this person or this area, this functional area, is being done properly. But sometimes if you're not doing the work currently, you don't understand where the systems meet the human interface in a physical area. So in the packing and preservation area, as you can imagine, you have things smaller than this and things bigger than this room. And those are handled completely differently, and oftentimes somewhat more complicated based on size and weight for a person to individually do. So the checklist sort of was made with the assumption that everything was smaller than this and didn't accommodate the really large things that this individual had to do, and the process that goes on before that occurs and after that occurs. And so I started taking a look at the whole idea of end-to-end processing, which my next job was really important because I became a program manager for a warehousing system. And the contractor that we were using was doing their initial tests on pieces of paper. So it had a barcode on it, and they would wand a piece of paper in, and they were doing all the tests, and the system worked fine with pieces of paper with barcodes on it. But when we got into the warehouse and we had to wand a box like this or a box like this that was coming down the conveyor, it didn't work so well because of the physical aspects of the whole thing. And so when you start understanding the operations that you're dealing with and then trying to connect the technology to it, you really have to have an understanding of physically what goes on in the operation in order to bring the technology to bear on it. And so I guess you could say my experience is built on each other because, first I did the operational inspections and then I went into the technology application to make those operations better. But then I had to bring our contractors along with us and give them those operational touch points. So when they were doing their piece of the business, they understood it wasn't as simple as wanding a piece of paper, but you had to deal with the physical aspects of the type of cargo that we were moving.
Sure. Human factors engineering. Actually, so I think that, when you and I really started working together was with the nuclear stuff. And I think that, at the time that all of that was going on, and, we recognize now it really had to do with the label that was on that package. Actually, that there were so many labels on that package and it was really hard to decipher, but it wasn't until later on in my career, when I got out to acquisition, that I realized that had everything to do with PHS&T, right? And so had we done the PHS&T phase on that a piece of nuclear weapons related material at the time, there may have been a different outcome. And additionally, like I also learned that again when we realized that we had stored all of the B2 windscreens in a facility that didn't have climate control, right? And we stored them in their shipping container instead of their storage container, and ended up, ruining an entire lifetime supply of it. But you're right. So, sometimes it takes a couple assignments before you arrive at a place where you realize what you learned the last assignment before. I appreciate
It all
that.
builds on itself if you're really taking a look at it at the enterprise level. Each experience you have contributes to your view of the next steps in your career. And so it's important to understand that. And it's also important to get out of your comfort zone a little bit to build on those experiences, because our Air Force is very complex. Our logistics community is very complex, and no one person can learn or know everything. But you can certainly build throughout your career your knowledge base and experience, and then sharing that with other people that have different experiences really makes the Air Force come up with a better solution set to whatever the problem at hand is.
Yes, ma'am. I agree. So you've led through some really complex and high pressure moments across the enterprise. What experiences do you think most shaped how you approach leadership?
Well, I talked about the convoy ops and the importance of communication. I think that was a very big eye opener for me. And then each experience I had, I guess the first experience I had as an SES put me right in the joint systems arena. And there was a thought at the time, and this comes in and out of our DOD, now DOW, frequently, that logistics systems across the services could be the same. That why wouldn't we standardize on a logistics system? Because logistics should be pretty much the same for all of the services. But what I learned in that job is it's not true. I talked a little bit about the challenge the Navy has in is different than, because of their mobility at sea, is a little bit different than the resupply of some of our installations. Although I would say that with some of our ACE maneuvering operational activities, it's getting a little closer to that, right? Because we're looking at pickup locations and spokes and hubs that we're going to have to deploy to that perhaps we haven't deployed before. But what I found is it's really what's important to each service is important because of the way they operate. And so in the ship environment, there's space constraints. So space becomes really, really important to the Navy in storage. And so they're looking for ways to compress and make sure that what they carry with them is the most important things to keeping readiness. And they need to understand what they can fit on that ship. And so they keep cube and unit information updated on their records, and it becomes most important to them. It wasn't so important to the Air Force, and it wasn't so important to the Army. And so there's different inventory models that drive that to affect what we're going to take on ship versus what we might stock at an installation level to support readiness in the Air Force. And so the models are different. They need to be different because the constraints are different. And organizational structure is different as well. So in the Air Force, the engineering authorities predominantly rest, for instance, with the acquisition programs and not in sustainment. And so at the installation level, they go back to the program offices for engineering disposition. In the Navy, on board ship, they have engineers on board ship that deal with important parts of the ship, like the engine, because if the engine goes, the ship doesn't go. And so they have an engineering officer, engineering duty officer that can do disposition of activities and maintenance activities right on board that ship embedded in the unit. And so the process is completely different for each of the services. And saying that you could have a logistics or maintenance or a supply system that's standard across those activities became almost impossible because the driving forces are different and the way the services deploy are different and their organizational structures are different. So we don't embed engineers in our units. We either send the engineers to do disposition authority from the program offices, or there's a document process that goes back to get the engineering authority for that. And so it's really important when you're talking about systems and activities to understand the operational construct and what drives that operation in order to successfully decide what your logistics strategy is going to be and what the systems that support that. I'll give another example. I didn't understand the difference between a Navy's tech manual and the Air Force tech order. They both explain the technical direction that you needed to take to perform a maintenance activity, what the safety features needed to be, and what those steps must be. But in the Air Force, it is a technical order because those engineers are not present on site. So that order to the field is the exact process that you want them to follow, because you have no engineer looking over the shoulder saying, it's okay if you don't take that step in this instance, or here's the disposition of something that you found that maybe was not expected in the tech manual. So the tech manual is somewhat a suggested order of events on how to maintain, whereas in the Air Force, a tech order is a direct order that must be followed. And so the systems surrounding how to automate that and how to present it to an airman versus a sailor is completely different, because the authorities of what's on ship in the unit is different in the Navy versus the authorities of that maintainer in that unit in the Air Force. And so that I didn't understand that till I came to the Air Force, and you brought up the nuclear experience. And you probably recall we had a Navy team come in and do an analysis on the Air Force's processes and activities. And it was an eye-opener to me when the Navy folks came to talk to me, assumed that there would be engineers in the field in the Air Force providing oversight to this nuclear-related material that we were talking about. And we had to say, no, we have no engineers embedded in that activity. Those engineers are elsewhere in our process. And here's the process we go through to get engineering disposition. It was only then that I began to understand the difference between a tech manual and a tech order, because of the difference in the way Air Force deploys its maintainers versus the Navy.
I think that's a really good point. I think that the Air Force, to a certain extent, has tried with AFIT, the Air Force engineering and tech folks that originally started down in ACC. I'm not even sure how many we have left of those, but, to really kind of try and add, those engineering folks in the operational units. A lot of times now, especially with all of these CLS and the PBLs that we have, we tend to have more field service reps, which are paid for and contracted through the OEMs with our CLS contracts. But I see your point. The engineers that were out in the field, the AFITS folks, we certainly didn't have very many of them. I wouldn't have necessarily. They were normally retired, maintainers and experts, and not necessarily engineers themselves, although they referred to them as engineering folks. So one of the things that you are most definitely known for is calm under pressure. You're always the peaceful one in the room. Everybody looks to you when anarchy is occurring. You're the one that everyone comes to. So as leaders progress and they gain, visibility on how decisions are made, from your perspective, what distinguishes leaders who are truly effective in those environments versus who are not?
Well, I think that, building your leadership is certainly about building on your experiences that you have. And, as you move through your career and you encounter problems that you have to fix, or you have to get the right team together to fix, you start to build an understanding of your strengths and, frankly, of the strengths of the team around you. And so it's a lot about understanding and collaborating enough prior to the emergency that you have you understand the complexities and who you have to pull in to get after a certain problem. And so I think those experiences start like having you get I call it the spidey sense that understanding of kind of where this problem set is. Is this a immediate problem that we've got to deal with right now because it's a life or death situation, or is this something that we can be a little more deliberate at? And a lot of times we don't sit long enough to kind of tell the difference, because we do it in our careers encounter both. You know, if we're in the middle of an operation, it could be a life or death, and we need to take care of it right now. But sometimes we treat every problem as if it's a life or death situation, and it just isn't. It's about learning how to gauge the difference on when you have to take immediate action and when you can be a little more deliberate. And it doesn't matter how far you are away from an operation, that doesn't gauge whether you need to take immediate action. And so just because you're sitting here at headquarters AFMC supporting Operation today doesn't mean that you don't need to take action right away. We have a whole activity that we have, making sure that those operations are supported and those units are ready. So it's not the distance from where the activity or the operation is taken that makes a difference. It's really the implications to the operation and what you need to do to fill that pipeline to make sure that the airmen on the other end are getting what they need to support their operations.
I appreciate that. So, you know, a lot of times, especially when decisions have to be made, in a split second and not necessarily with, all of the information that we would like to have, but with what we have in front of us, how important do you think it is for candor at that point? And so, a lot of times, especially in, staff organizations, we spend a lot of time focusing on how we say things and the politics around things. But at some point, direct feedback and clarity should come into play as well. And so how do you pick those situations where you just decide to be very direct versus a little bit softer? Because I've seen you do both. And when you're being very direct, we all know you're being very direct. And but it would be interesting to understand how your thought process between how you approach things.
I think some of this is just experience, because I can think of times when I didn't get it right. So it's not like I always got it right. I just learned sort of the best way to read a situation and then to determine what's necessary. And so as a leader, you get to play a number of roles. Certainly decision maker is one of those. But if you make all the decisions based on your experience, how are the other people in the room going to get that experience and learn from those experiences so that they can the best what makes a difference and how to determine those activities? And so there's a number of ways that I learned and that I try and give other people the opportunity to learn. I mentioned my early on mentor that sent me around with a handful of questions every week. But I also had some mentors that allowed me to be in the room when they were on the phone with their peers talking about a problem set and trying to get at a collaborative solution where perhaps the two individuals did not agree. They were on different sides of that equation. And how did that leader approach that? And I got to hear a number of those, some of which seemed to be very successful and some just seemed to rise the ire and maybe not actually come up with a solution set. And it's about what I call prepping the battlefield. And that is not waiting until there is a problem to build that network and trust with the people that you're going to have to collaborate with. So whether you're on staff or in a program office, building that trust and network together through a series of events or processes where essentially you prove to people you have their back, that you're after what's best for the Air Force and what's best for the program, and not after potentially what's best for your individual functional area. And so you have to build that network so that when you have to make that decision that you know is going to be unpopular with at least half the people in the room, you can look at those folks and they will understand that you know you're making a decision that they don't like, but you've already built the trust that you have the best interest of the program and the enterprise in mind when you're saying what you're saying. And then you can give the why, right? You might not be able to give the why at that exact moment. Like when I overturned a recommended source selection from the team of folks that were in that source selection process, and I was the source selection official. And I listened to them very carefully, what they were saying, and then I looked at what they had written in their presentations to me on what their recommendation was. And what I heard them say in terms of management risk and what they had on the piece of paper wasn't the same. And so I did a little homework and read that piece of the proposal. And I decided that I needed to call them back in and overturn what their recommendation was going to be. And then I gave them the why. And what you told me in terms of risk isn't the way you measured it on this piece of paper. And here's where I see the issues associated, which rose the risk to me on this one solicitation higher than what you've articulated. And I actually think a different contractor should be the recommendation. And after we talked it through, they understood and actually agreed with what that was. And so there's a lot of pre-work done so that they kind of could be open with me. But then when I made the decision, I gave the why as well. And you may not be able to do it at the exact moment, but I think having that communication helps other people learn as well. And so I think as leaders, we have to spend some time making sure that folks get the experiences or get the opportunities to get the experiences that we had that help build our, what you might call calmness under stress. And because that doesn't happen overnight. That happens by being exposed to different experiences, making some mistakes, because not everybody is perfect, learning from those mistakes, and then building on that experience. And so I think that's why we after 48 years with the Air Force and the Navy, I have multiple experiences. And so I think that's people say they turn to me for advice and guidance. Well, it's come from 48 years of both making mistakes and getting it right.
I think that's great. And so that really kind of like flows into the next couple of questions. But I think that this really leads nicely into, so in your experience with the source selection, even though, like they were documented, you had the courage to kind of think through it and, kind of assess the risks on your own. And so I think that one of the things that we all need to kind of be cognizant of is how to avoid groupthink, so to speak. And so from your perspective, like what are some things that you have employed in the past really to kind of, break that groupthink up, besides you yourself having to step in and saying, no, I don't agree with this and here's why?
I think the right questions to ask the team sometimes breaks up sometimes groupthink is just habit. We get exposed to a tremendous amount of information every day, and we have to sift through things pretty fast in order to just do daily what we need to do to support the mission. And when we do that, we're making assumptions. We're assuming that the things that we're doing are the same, that our process supports that activity, or we have to make a lot of assumptions that things are the same, or that our processes, our standard practices and processes fit this situation. And so sometimes just asking the question of, is there anything different about this problem than what we've encountered before? Or this seems to be a different circumstance than what you're suggesting. The problem seems a little different to me than what you're suggesting. And I'm feeling it's a little more this problem set than what you're talking about. And then having some discussions and listening to those activities, because there is somebody else in the room thinking the same way that you are, that this isn't quite right. They just haven't really maybe put their finger on exactly what that is yet, and they're still mulling it over. And so just trying to draw out some discussions allows people the freedom to maybe say, I don't think this is the same as what we needed to do the last time. I think we need to look at this a little bit differently. And I see that a lot as we're applying new technologies to either current problem sets or new problem sets. We tend to think we understand what this technology set is based on our history. And then we think that it could support the processes that we have, the same processes we have today, rather than thinking through, does this technology advantage give us an opportunity to streamline our processes instead of duplicate them? And I use an example all the time. Those Holy Joes that we used to have, that we used to take around and get everybody to sign off on whatever that document was that we were coordinating on. We actually do that same thing today in our new technology, sitting on our desktop with emails, right? And TMT. We are very much sequential in our activities instead of collaborative, even though we have the technologies on our desktop to be more collaborative. But what does that take? That takes leaders that are willing to take a deep breath and allow that collaboration to occur, knowing that what is in front of them right now is not soup yet, because the collaboration hasn't occurred. People's eyes on it are not finished yet, because it's still asynchronous, even though we're trying to collaborate on that work site. So even though my 8th grade English teacher would roll over in her grave right now if I said this, I can't fixate on the fact that commas and the periods aren't in the right place yet. I have to let it bear out. I have to let the ideas start flowing, and then a finished product will get there with the commas in the right place and the periods in the right place. And so that takes some leadership understanding to take advantage of this new technologies and be able to perhaps get things staffed faster than the old Holy Joes that we carried around from office to office. But the finished product isn't ready for me to sign off on yet. It still has some work to be done, and I need to let that work complete itself.
Now, I appreciate that. And, so I think that, having worked with and around you for a while now, like that's one of the things that that as a leader, that I think that you've always been really good at, is creating an environment where, people can like bring other ideas or out of the box, or, opportunities for other considerations. So how would you recommend, or what would you recommend to other leaders to kind of duplicate that environment or encourage, that innovative thought?
Well, I think you have to consider it. I like to talk about being a lifelong learner, that things change, my gosh, the technology that has come since I've been in place for 48 years. When I think about it, I didn't have a computer on my desktop when I first started. We didn't even have electric typewriters in some instances. It was still very much the pound typewriter. We had carbon copy forms. Um, PowerPoint slides were on cellophane that you put on overheads. So there's been a tremendous technology change, yet I don't feel like we've taken advantage of it in our workspace on how we basically get work done. So there's some opportunity there. But I think being a lifelong learner also means trying different things. And so, being an early adopter of some of the technologies so that you get to understand the strengths of the technology and maybe how to use it differently, and you can start encouraging other people to use it differently and changing the practice and the process. And so, we're doing a lot of that. There are some people, some leaders that definitely like their PowerPoint and like their pieces of paper, and there are some that have adapted to dashboards and are good with having a presentation be done on a dashboard instead of a PowerPoint chart. Be open to changing your the way that you get information to some of the newer activities and actions out there. Use Gen I to, get your thoughts together on a presentation. I'm not suggesting that you use just Gen I out of the box to give your presentation, but you need to personalize it. You need to make it a little more inspirational based on your personality as a leader. And I also suggest you can't necessarily replicate or pattern what I do, because you have to do what's comfortable for you. And so as a leader, one of the ways to build trust is being comfortable in your own skin and in your leadership techniques. And so I'm not the most extroverted person in the world. So leadership by walking around and all day long, like somebody like General Hurry does, is not my style. It exhausts me, and then I'm not my best for either mentoring somebody or helping a group of people solve a problem. And so I need to do it in smaller steps and with a smaller group of people that I'm more comfortable with in order to build that network and more one-on-one discussions than, walking around and just talking to anybody I encounter in the hallway. I do some of that. I mean, some of that's important, but I have to do it in small increments because it tires me out, and I recognize that. And so you have to be comfortable. And if I spent all day going down to the road and trying to mentor people just by walking around and seeing who I encounter, by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm going to be exhausted. And the person that I met at 4 o'clock in the afternoon is not going to get the best advice from me, and is probably going to walk away saying, wow, either she's pissed off at me or I don't understand a word she said. And so that's not fair, right? That's not fair to me, and it's not fair to the individual because they haven't gotten my best. And so as leaders, you need to be self-aware. And there's not going to be one cookbook that you're going to go to that says, yeah, I'm just going to replicate what that book says because it seems to be successful for everybody else. Trust is built on empathy and personality. And when somebody's being false to you, right? When they're not their best, or they're not really engaged because they're tired. That. And that doesn't build trust. That doesn't build a relationship with that leader where downstream you feel comfortable with coming to them with a problem set. It is about building that trust, right? And so you gotta know what you can do, what you're good at, and not try and be things you're not.
Absolutely. I think so I've often heard you say, being your authentic self, right? And being comfortable enough and confident enough in who you are um, what your intentions are, you know, and going forward and not being afraid to be that. And so I do appreciate, your comments about, being an introvert versus an extrovert, because I think that that's one of the things that, for as long as you and I have known each other, that people really mistake about you. You're like, you are a huge introvert. and 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 I think that when someone who has been as successful as you are, right? When you're an introvert, that's confusing to people, right? They, it seems to like conflict, but it's not, and you've managed it really, really well.
Well,
So
interestingly enough, more military leaders are introverts than extroverts, according to the data, which I found fascinating.
yeah.
And I think people sometimes mistake introvert for not being able to take a leadership role or make decisions. An introvert just means uh, you give up energy to people versus getting energy from people. It doesn't mean you can't make presentations. It doesn't mean you can't be personable. It's just what tires you out, right? And so energy levels are important as a leader, and you need to do things you have to preserve your energy level, because if you lose all your reserves, then you're not there for that important decision or that important uh, problem set that needs to be solved right now. And so it's really a lot about making sure that you monitor and measure and become resilient in your leadership. And that gets after making sure you're eating right, you're sleeping right, and you're doing the right things in order to uh, both grow the leaders of tomorrow and take care of the mission today.
No, that's excellent. The pillars of the Air Force, right? So we are running a little bit long, but I really think that this last part is important because so over the last, couple weeks, um, uh, with Epic Fury, we have heard the Secretary of War and the Joint Chief and, multiple other senior leaders administration really talking about logistics, sustainment, and really how that equates to combat power. And I think that, even with the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, reiterating fly, fix, and fight, it is really refocused the attention on sustainment. So do you think with all of the increased attention that we're getting on sustainment right now, that this is going to allow for a cultural shift going forward, particularly with acquisition reform, of course?
Well, I think it's certainly providing some focus. And I think some of the new operational maneuver space that we're trying to work through in exercises also is refocusing on logistics. My favorite quote on that, by the way, is Leo Marquez's quote on logistics. And he kind of said, "Don't talk to me about logistics tail. There is no logistics tail. If our missiles and weapons are the teeth of our military, then logistics is the muscle, the tendon, the sinews that make the teeth bite down and hold on. Logistics is the jawbone, not the tail. The jawbone. Do you hear me?"
Yeah.
And those of us in logistics have always known that, you know. And there's tons of leaders that have talked about, there's lots of quotes about how wars are won or lost on logistics. And you can see some of that going on in Ukraine right now, right? So in the acquisition community, we always talk that lifecycle management is a responsibility of the program office. But a lot of times the development end of the program gets far more attention than the sustainment or logistics end of the program. And a lot of that is early on in the program. Sometimes sustainment is looked at as trade space to get capability. And then there's really got to be a balanced discussion of making sure that we're resourcing the sustainment as well as the capability end. And there's going to be there's got to be a balanced discussion going on in trade space. And so I think some of the acquisition transformation discussions that are going on about what is the trade space on the requirements or capability side, so that when we have a resource constraint, we can talk about what we know we have to do to sustain the capability, and what trade space do we have on the capability side or the requirement side to make sure that we can bring this program in at a reasonable cost that the Air Force can afford. We don't have a lot of the digital models that we need in order to really understand that trade space better than we do today. And so I think the digital material management capabilities that we're talking about and building those models that better understand cost and trade space would really focus our discussions on what do we need to balance capability versus the readiness of that capability to support an operation. And so I would say we have some work to do on building that technology and those models in order to make sure that our program offices have the toolkit that they need to have those discussions in those multidiscipline teams you were talking about, that we've given them the tools and analysis threads so that we can have those discussions, frankly, with the operational communities, with the IDO, with the 5-7 futures discussion, so that upfront we can do that planning and understand what the costs are and the affordability issues associated with them. So what I see SecWar and the Secretary of the Air Force talking about is how do we get after that trade space a lot better, and I do think it needs better tools. There's a lot of discussion going on drawing the lines differently and in the organizational structure on where the enterprise needs to go as an acquisition community, and what are the authorities that the acquisition community needs to get after really making faster and better trade space so they can get the operational capability out faster. I don't think it makes much difference where you draw the organization lines. I think which makes a difference is that you make sure that that multidiscipline team has the tools they need to successfully understand that trade space from an operational capability and a sustainment capability. Because getting back to that jawbone, if you're going to support the operations, you've got to support the operations and the jawbone, that logistics that holds those operations together in the end state.
Yes, ma'am. So how important do you think that the NDA language that elevates the PSM to the PM is going to be going forward in ensuring that we're having those conversations?
Well, the intent of the original laws that put the PSM together was to put more teeth into those sustainment decisions, to elevate them to a discussion level that is in that trade space with capability. I don't think we've achieved that. Part of it is we don't have the tools yet. And part of that is I don't know that we totally understand the dynamics that needs to occur in the program offices between the PSMs, the PEOs, and the PMs in those trade space decisions. And so I do think the NDAA language is pointing out we still have some work to do there. And in this transformation activity, as we're delivering capability, we also need to make sure that we can sustain that capability, because it does not become operational without the ability to sustain it through the operational events that occur.
Yes, ma'am. So then we've talked about this quite a bit over the years, and you often talk about how it takes decades for a true culture shift, and really I think that is an aspect of this that has to be considered, right? Is how we change the culture, and we embrace the fact that the PSMs and the loggies that are in the program offices that who are often maybe considered like they're, being difficult because they're not agreeing with everything, but in reality, they're the ones that are really trying to ensure that we're thinking through the second and third order effects of all of our decisions, right? And so from a culture perspective, like what are some things that, you would offer to the next generation of, PMs and PSMs of things that, they might be able to do to help shift that narrative?
We have people that talk about extreme teaming, and I think a program office has got to be in this extreme teaming dynamics where everyone is contributing to the outcomes that we're looking for and everyone's valued in that process. And I've seen it occur very well on program offices, and then I've seen it not occur very well at all. And it really depends on building that extreme teaming where the entire program office multidiscipline activity is valued and part of the team, and grow together really in making this culture, because the speed at which we can do things is really dependent on the speed of each of the individuals coming together to make that program effective. And you can point to ones that run very, very well and very, very fast and taken the sustainment, and ones that are having difficulty with that, and in fact are still having difficulty with that. I think building that culture again goes back, it's a lifelong activity to make these things happen. And my belief is no one personality can drive that. It's got to be as an enterprise level. And so we've got to have the entire team of LCMC, AFSC, IMSC, the test centers, all of the Nuke Weapon Center all have to be together driving this. And however they end up drawing the lines of organizational structure, those activities still need to integrate together to drive the culture, to drive delivery, because AFCAC's got to be there for the MilCon. You talked about the package material handling. All of that has to come together and make this successful. All the product support elements with the acquisition communities to make sure that our Air Force operations are successful. So they can draw the lines around AFMC however they want to. Those activities need to come together for the acquisition community to deliver a capability.
Yes, ma'am. So we are kind of running over, but I think that this last question is important. So I wanted to give you an opportunity, as you're coming to your retirement here, I think that the 31st of March is your last day. So, if there is like one accomplishment that you've had that maybe you're the most proud of.
I don't think that I can think of necessarily one. I think, when we successfully showed that Air Force airmen can be just as good as the Army convoy operations, that was a proud moment, not just for me, but for the Air Force. I think some of the technology stuff that I, over time, implemented, really to try and get a more integrated enterprise across Department of Defense. Taking a look at supply and maintenance as an integrated function instead of two separate functional areas, because they're so intertwined and dependent on each other. Implemented that within the RAMP program, for instance, carried that forward in an attempt in MROI to really try and break down, even in the logistics community itself, the stovepipes that tend to fall between our maintenance and supply functional communities. we're not there yet. We still need to integrate that more, but I think some of those integrations have occurred, and we're on the way of trying to make that integration really to be seamless so that we can seamlessly support the operations, because I still believe supply and maintenance brings 60% of our supply chain is in the maintenance activities. So we're very dependent on maintenance in order to get after the supply chain.
Yes, ma'am.
Particularly in the aviation environment, where the component parts are very much more expensive than they are, for instance, in the Army or the Navy shipbuilding area.
Absolutely. So are there any decisions or any, things, activities that you regret that you wish you could go back and change, or
No, not so much change, but one of the things that happens as you get different experiences is sometimes you get to live with the decision that you've made about resources that somebody else had implications to somebody else. So when I went from A4P, who had the logistics panel and the installation support panel, from IMSC, I got to live with some decisions that I had to make when I was A4P, where we cut some aspects of the portfolio. And I was down at IMSC, and I made a comment. I said, well, who in the Pentagon thought that was a good idea to cut? And then I thought about it and said, oh, that was me. And so
did anybody have the courage to tell you it was you, or did you just figure it out on your own?
So I figured it out, and I ratted on myself.
Very nice.
But sometimes where you're sitting, you have a limited amount of time to decide where you're going to take cuts. The corporate structure says we can't afford to have this much money going to FSRM. And so you look across the FSRM portfolio, and in the last minute, you make a decision. And maybe you didn't have all the information that you needed to make that decision, but that was what you needed to make at the time. And so I don't know that I would be able to undo it again, but yeah, I regretted it because I had to live with it.
That happens. Fair enough. So the last question here, kind of talks about, what, you sharing your thoughts on what you think is the most important for logistics and airmen going forward. But we can open the aperture a little bit, and maybe this is your opportunity. Like, this is, what if there's something that you could, communicate, to all the loggies across the Air Force, what would you want them to know the most?
Well, first of all, and I know they know this already, what they do day in and day out, as the chief says, is truly important to flying and fighting, right? And so wherever you are in the cog, make sure you do what you do every day the best you can, because it's truly important to the Air Force. And then the second thing I would say is do everything that you can to harvest the advantage that we will get from technology. There's more opportunity for us to implement more modern technology within the logistics arena than we've taken advantage of. And so as the technology gets cheaper, as tool sets become more available on your desktop, take every advantage of using those tool sets to make your day-to-day job easier. Explore them. Don't be afraid to make some mistakes in the technology that is on your desktop or that is going out there. The Secretary of War has asked everybody to explore Gen I and see how that might change your day-to-day activities and make it better for the Air Force and make your job easier. You should not be afraid to make your job easier. And so explore all of that with certainly, the boss would say, make sure you're being safe as you explore it. Don't do anything that's going to put you in harm's way or any other airmen in harm's way, but still explore what technology can do for us, as we have to be more agile and faster. And so explore all of that with certainly, the boss would say, make sure you're being safe as you explore it. Don't do anything that's going to put you in harm's way or any other airmen in harm's way, but still explore what technology can do for us, as we have to be more agile and faster. And so explore all of that with certainly, the boss would say, make sure you're being safe as you explore it. Don't do anything that's going to put you in harm's way or any other airmen in harm's way, but still explore what technology can do for us, as we have to be more agile and faster. to support an operation that is going to be need to be more agile and faster.
Yes, ma'am. I agree with all that. I think that there's lots of opportunity out there. And, one of the models that you and I have talked about is, really kind of using multiple different AI to kind of debate against each other, really to come up with like the best answer. And I really appreciated the opportunity to get to use that and kind of bounce those things off of you as well. So I think that this is bringing us to an end. So I just want to say thank you very much for sitting here with us. You've been extraordinary. Not really sure what the Air Force feels like without you. It seems it's a little frightening, not to just to me, but to several of our other leaders and several loggies. But you have certainly paved the path for us, and our command historian has done a fantastic job of documenting that. And so we are persistently like reaching out to him and saying, hey, is there any documentation about what Miss Estep said about this? And then sure enough, he sends it to us. So Ray has done a good job of capturing that. So we appreciate that. But also, I don't think any of us will be too afraid to reach out and ask questions either. So thank you for.
I'm not dying. I'm still in the space. I'm not going to be working for our Air Force, but I'm still available for mentoring discussions for anybody that's interested. And to people that think that are worried about me leaving, I can tell you that we have many more airmen and civilians that have the experience and leadership qualities that can continue on making our Air Force better. And I encourage you all to keep doing that. And I'm very confident that the Air Force will continue to grow and survive without me.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. You've done a good job of mentoring a lot of folks after you. All right. Well, I think that's it. So thank you very much, ma'am. I appreciate your time today, and look forward to seeing you on the other side.
All right.
The conversation doesn't end here. Your perspective is crucial as we continue to decode the path to success in civilian logistics. Scan the QR code on your screen now. Let us know your thoughts on today's topic and share your ideas for what you want us to explore next. Your feedback directly shapes the future of this podcast. Help us make Logistics Uncoded the resource you need. Thank you for listening.